A year ago, Hamas, in a surprise and rather very brutal attack in southern Israel, sought to bring a kind of regional war on Israel. And while it didn't happen right away, if we look at where we are today, with Israeli soldiers in Lebanon, with Israeli airplanes headed constantly to Syria, Iraq, and also to Yemen, and of course with a reconstituted Hamas to some extent in northern Gaza, which shot rockets at Israel today, we are a little closer than one might want to their vision of a regional war with Israel.
It's something to reflect on, given everything that's changed in the past year, and as you mentioned, further Israeli military operations in northern Gaza over the weekend. I mean, firstly, just what do we know about what happened that over the weekend in Gaza?
What we understand is that the Israelis have been, quote unquote, controlling northern Gaza for a while, and they, around the Jabalia refugee camp, and in it, they said there was a reconstituted Hamas situation in which they felt they needed to go in and attack them more. So that's what happened. And then, meanwhile, they've also issued an order for people to leave from their southward and have expanded the so-called humanitarian area in southern Gaza for those people to go to. Meanwhile, there were rockets that were shot from there today. So the situation is that the fight is back on. They say that there have been a reconstitution of Hamas in northern Gaza that they feel the need to engage with.
And meanwhile, Ethan, the Israeli offensive in the southern part of Beirut at least continues, but also
yes,
a continued number of attacks on the capital, Beirut. Where do we stand on that element, that stance, that angle of this conflict?
So, quite right. The Israelis say that they've killed several hundred, I think about 500 now, militants of Hezbollah. They have been, of course, they killed the head of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah, and it is very possible that they killed his replacement. We are still unclear about that man's fate. But they've been sending troops in, and they say they've been finding tunnels and sort of ready rooms and places from which they say Hezbollah was preparing an October 7th style attack on Israel, on northern Israel, soon. So it looks like there's enormous amount of fighting going on in all directions. It's unclear how this can end, and Israel is rethinking its strategic doctrine as it goes forward, as to be a much more aggressive situation. And then of course we're also waiting to see what happens with Iran. Iran last week sent 200 ballistic missiles at Israel, and Israel has vowed to retaliate, and it certainly will at some point in the coming days or weeks. And a direct confrontation between Israel and Iran is precisely the most dangerous situation we can imagine, both in terms of civilian deaths everywhere, and of course, energy and other things in the region.
How much is that change in the strategic doctrine and indeed the change that Israel has faced forming part of the conversations today, when there are, of course, ceremonies taking place to mark a year on since the Hamas attack?
I think it's an important part of the conversation. A lot of what's being focused on in Israel today is the sort of the grief in the morning of the 1,200 people who were killed, the 100 hostages still held in Gaza, about a third of whom at least are dead, and the general sense of that in Israel that the concept of a Zionist enterprise, which was going to protect Jews after World War II, had failed in its most basic task, and the sense of what needs to be done to change that. And of course, on the other side, the Palestinian side, there's an enormous sense of grief and mourning. There are more than 40,000 people dead in Gaza. And in the West Bank, people can't move very well. There's a very tightened security order underway. So it's a very tense period here, very tense indeed.
Ethan, how would you characterize US influence over Israel at this point? We've been hearing from the vice president, the presidential nominee, of course, for the Democrats, Kamala Harris, speaking over the weekend. Is it simplistic to suggest that US influence has just waned, or is it more complicated than that? How do you think about US politics
I
and
don't
Israel?
think it's simplistic. I think it's correct. First of all, I mean, it has waned, but of course, it has waned over a period of decades. This is it's been many years since the United States could tell Israel what to do. It did so perhaps in the 1980s when it was in Lebanon, but in the last 20 or 25 years, when Israel has grown into a very important power, huge intelligence service, huge military industry that the United States effectively depends on in the region, the relationship, of course, is still superpower to small country, but in a different way. It's a different kind of partnership, and the willingness of Israel to really listen if it believes its own interests are at stake is low. And this is particularly true, of course, as we approach an election in the United States and the notion that maybe there'll be a change of administration. So I think that the influence is, in fact, quite limited. It's true. Now, it is also true that for Israel to really wage war in the region, both in Lebanon and in Iran, it depends on American weapons and ammunition and goodwill. So there is this dance that the two are playing. And I think that at the sort of military level, they get along fairly well, and at the political level, much less well.